You can tell that our esteemed moderator was just too humble to introduce himself, and he's been assigned this interesting topic about proper Presbyterian propagation. And I was wondering why Pastor Brinegar was not given this assignment talking about Presbyterian propagation for building the church. But so we'll wait and see how you want to develop that.
I asked my wife last night if she could put some buttons on my collar so I wouldn't have to wear a tie. But that didn't pan out very well either. I think over the years we've lived in the Philadelphia area, probably I think around 23, 24 years now. And historically, you're familiar with the nation's historical sites that are there, but you don't put it in perspective until you see how things unfold before your eyes. Lived in the Germantown section of the city for quite a while, and right down the road was the Battle of Germantown. Holes in the walls of the buildings, the Cliveden, and back and forth where it took place. Down into the Wick House, which was probably a half mile, quarter mile down from where we lived. 1690, the Quaker family of the Wicks, and apparently General Lafayette used that as his residence. In Philadelphia, or in the Germantown downtown section, there's an apparent, we saw it, and the word has it that's where John Witherspoon had preached from this place in its location. Brother Glenn took me down to the house of Samuel Davies down in Delaware, falling sadly apart, and no one seems to care about its roots. And as I'm reading through the records, 1800s and so forth, of the properties and that which related to the early Presbyterian Church, I'm reading of communities and such where I'm saying, that's just over here, where we live. The Bluebell, it's just over here. It's just over here. It's all right there. And sometimes history, we can see it, and it just kind of passes us by. So when Chris was going through his European hand, coming to America, it filled in a lot for me of the character of the men and the women who came here. And it wasn't their plan to do it, but it was God's plan. What was the nature and the character of the men, women, the church, of the founders of this land? And it was most beneficial. For if thou holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house will be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. One of the most difficult tasks I think a speaker faces at times is to figuratively escort a character from the past into the present. To take that individual with all they were and all they had into the present day. To help us understand that individual in the context of his history, as well as in the present time. How can I best know an individual as he lived in the past, under different circumstances, as I bring him forth? And in truth, whose life was in the broadest sense consists very little of what today we find commonplace, of what we understand as life in itself. In addition, in researching historical characters, we often are at the mercy of sources, an assortment of biographers, period experts, supporters, as well as critics, all of whom may not necessarily be present, presenting us a complete and unbiased picture. Whether it's Augustine or Luther, whether it's McKimmey or Machen or whomever, we're best served to put ourselves in their shoes, as it were, and see the life and ministry as they had it and how it affects us at our current time. Francis McKimmey, and I I'll tell you this in humility, I wanted to have an Irish accent, but Googling Irish accents is impossible. So you're going to be stuck with English, German, American. Born in Ireland, Scottish parents around 1658. William Sprague says that he became hopefully pious at the age of 14, meaning the opinions of this young man were rather favorable at that age. He was viewed as possessing a godly lifestyle in his early teens. By 18, he was enrolled in the University of Glasgow, and on January 28, 1680, at the age of 22, he was introduced to his presbytery, the Presbytery of Lagam, by his pastor, and was licensed by year's end. Again, the education that he received at the university contained a lot more than just the book studies. And if you think of the time in which he lived, the uprisings, as Chris had mentioned, the persecution in both Ireland and Scotland of these Presbyterian men was all part of his education. 7 years later, application was made to the presbytery by Captain Archibald Johnson to secure a minister for the island of Barbados. Not long after that, application was made by a Colonel William Stevens, also a Presbyterian, to send ministers to Maryland. Francis McKimmey was ordained with the view of coming to the colonies, and he did, 1683, and actually the records show that he was preaching in Rehoboth, Maryland at that same year. I happened in my car, head south from Philadelphia down I-95, and I get off at the Christiana exit 4A, head southeast into Delaware, continue on down through the Delmarva Peninsula, heading on south, very relatively fertile strip of soil connecting Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. As you travel on down through that area, you eventually come to Somerset County, the place of the first McKimmey Church. It's a 4-hour drive, and actually a rather pleasant one. A lot of land, open farm fields, a smattering of seasonal beach cottages and motels as you move over closer to the shore. However, to make that same trip back in the late 1600s would have taken at least 3 days, if my horse was fit and if I pushed him hard. Obviously, there were no beachgoers back in those days, no recreational fishermen with boats in tow, vying for the highways. As a matter of fact, there were really no highways to go on. There were no villages of any sort. There were no 7-Elevens where I could grab a hot coffee. Absolutely no Wi-Fi to find out what direction I ought to go in. No patient care, emergency care to look after that festering wound. Much of the journey was indeed wilderness, inhabited by some very rugged English settlers, some occasional Huguenots, Scotch-Irish, and a good number of American Indian tribes. Totally different from what we see today. I think about life back then, and it begs me to ask, what's the makeup of a man to leave his country and to come this far as a place of ministerial calling? Why would he give the strength of his youth to sail to a land practically unknown and to give that as a ministerial calling? A distant land where no ministry existed. As far as I know, that heart attitude, that spiritual commitment to what he had done wasn't picked up at a church planting seminar back in Scotland. He surely didn't read anything from an independent board publication calling for new missionaries in the colonies. Maybe it grew out of the harsh persecution of the Scots and the Irish at the time. The stories he heard back from settlers, and word came back of the things that were going on in the colonies. Even before he was born, word had traveled as it ventured into his heart. Nonetheless, I am convinced that Francis McKimmey accepted this call and entered into this particular ministry because from his earliest days, he was a man prepared by God. He was nurtured by godly men for a specific task, and he was obedient to that particular call for such a time as this. just reading of it, you don't see that. But when you back off and you see the picture of what took place before and what came after, he says, God had prepared him for such a service. Now, McKimmey did not settle down for a number of years, but was actually preaching as an itinerant as the Lord directed him. I throw out some dates. 1683, he arrived in Somerset County, Maryland. By the fall of that same year, he had gone to North Carolina. In returning to Maryland, he departed again in 1686 for a preaching tour down south, and by 1690, he was back up in Maryland. Think of the challenges. Think of the reaching out to areas where he had never gone before, but his heart was called. Eventually, he settled down in Accomack County, Virginia, which is, if you look at that Delmarva Peninsula, it's the very southern tip before you go into the mainland of Virginia. He did quite well in farming and trade, shipping, especially to the British West Indies. He's a man, I believe, that God had given other tasks to, and he accommodated them well. Eventually settling in Accomack County, in God's providence, the next year he married Naomi Anderson, the daughter of a successful businessman and landowner who clearly helped him become established in this virgin territory. Through this business, he was able to support his family and pay for his ministerial ventures. As a matter of fact, when Mr. Anderson died, the father of his bride, he gave him all of his ships and gave him all of the property and the land that he owned. And that really prospered him and provided for him. 1691, he became pastor of the Rehoboth Church and left for the city of Philadelphia the following year, and then on to the islands of Barbados. And not until 1698 did he return to the Eastern Shore. I give some applause to his wife. This is a man who was on the road a long time, and she ventured very well as far as taking care of properties and all of the business while he was away. In God's providential care, Francis McKimmey organized churches on the peninsula in Rehoboth, Mannequin, Snow Hill, Wicomico, and another one was called Pitts Creek, which established as close to the Virginia border as possible because he wasn't licensed yet to preach in Virginia. 1699 actually was his certificate to preach, and that was the first ever recorded in Virginia to allow a Protestant to preach there. Although he spent much of his time in Virginia, as we've already hinted, Francis McKimmey was not averse to traveling throughout the counties for business, but also for the preaching of the word. Going from South Carolina all the way up to Massachusetts, twice sailing to England for support, financial support, and also for ministerial support. And I commented to Mr. Lynch last night, the picture of those sailing vessels. Can you imagine flying the Atlantic in those little wooden things? Storms, opening up of the beams on the side. It's quite trusting in the Lord in that. Twice sailing back to England, and again on his return trip from his second voyage, finding 2 ministers and 2 years of support. Misters George McNeish, who was an Irishman, and John Hampton, Scotch-Irish. McKimmey twice was quite capable of representing himself in the court, in the colonies of Virginia and of New York, appealing on both occasions for the right to preach the gospel, receiving license to preach in those regions based upon the English Toleration Act of 1688. This was foundational, for McKimmey held that if freedom of religion could not be obtained in one colony, it would endanger the flourishing of it in them all. He saw the united responsibility of all colonies to, under the Toleration Act, to be able to have such a voice. Francis McKimmey also authored a catechism. Sadly, no copies of this remain, and a number of very influential letters and pamphlets. These pamphlets and letters were not only expressions of his thoughts, but they were very valid attempts to move people in certain directions, soliciting them to action. Succeeding generations, and there's really not too much written about him at the time, but succeeding generations favor him with these accolades. The apostle of the Chesapeake, the great apostle of American Presbyterianism, the father of the organized presbytery in America, the father of American Presbyterianism, a public-spirited citizen and distinguished advocate of religious rights, the prototypical home missionary among Presbyterian missions, a man of eminent piety, as well as strong intellectual powers and uncommonly fascinating address, a great Christian, a loyal churchman, and a convinced Calvinist, one of the builders of the American Republic. And I could go on and on with those accolades. Yet, he did have his critics. There was one New Yorker who had written the bishop in London and said that McKemmy is a great pillar of the Presbyterian sect who executes all the powers of a bishop, pretends to a great interest at court, and makes a great noise wherever he comes. Another said, this malicious man, well known in Virginia and Maryland to be a disturber of the peace and of all places in which he comes. That last outspoken critic was Lord Cornbury, the third Earl of Clarendon and the colonial governor of New York from 1702 to 08. In January of 1707, Cornbury had McKemmy and Reverend John Hampton arrested for preaching without license in New York. McKemmy was licensed to preach in Barbados, and Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, but was held because he was refused in New York. Hampton was summarily released, but McKemmy was held in jail for 46 days, and although he was acquitted by an Anglican jury, he had to pay his court cost of 83 pounds, 7 shillings, and 6 pence. He had to pay the court cost of his own trial, the court cost of his board as a prisoner, and he had to pay the salary of the men who prosecuted him. Following the case, Cornbury referred to McKemmy as a jack of all trades. He is a preacher, a doctor of physic, a merchant, counselor at law, and worst of all, a disturber of governments. And he was all that, and much more. It has been said that Francis McKemmy was neither a humble man nor a quiet one. Indeed, he seemed to seek out and to revel in disputes with those who did not share or who challenged his sense of conviction and righteousness. I would like to think he would have made a good Bible Presbyterian. In any case, all of that and so much more was accomplished within 25 years, the span of his lifetime. He died at his home somewhere between April 27th and August 4th in 1708 at the age of 50. At the age of 50. With a very little modest background to this man's life, we turn the page to consider the Protestant makeup of the colonies in the early 17th century, and the principle of which we know of Francis McKemmy was not the first Presbyterian clergyman to land on the American shores. Numerous others had been before him, earliest congregations, all the way up into New England. The first Presbyterian meeting houses were found on the eastern Long Island shores by 1640. And when Francis McKemmy was hopefully pious at the age of 14, there were already many Presbyterians found in Somerset County, Maryland. These were probably the ancestors of what would become the McKemmy churches in due time. Many other Calvinist bodies, such as Huguenots, Congregationalists, Dutch and German Reformed, early Baptists, and even some Anglicans settling from Philadelphia up into New York City, north into the Hudson River region, all the way up into New England. Majority of the Scottish Presbyterians came into the mid-Atlantic colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all the way down to the Carolinas. You also would have found Quakers settled in there, Pennsylvania, and the Puritans or Presbyterian Congregationalists throughout New England. In truth, when we speak of the first presbytery, there was one found even earlier. In the year 1698, it was called the Presbytery of Caledonia, located on the Isthmus of Panama. Settlers had gone there, along with their clergymen, and proceeded to organize a presbytery, but unfortunately, the persecuting spirit of the French, the Spanish, and English traders forced the Scots to leave the Isthmus of Panama. The presbytery disbanded. Many of them returned back to the home countries. Others moved on up into the colonies, not to be formed again. By the end of the 16th century, there were a fair number of Presbyterian churches in the areas already mentioned, albeit scattered. Some of these had congregational presbyteries. Others had but a single ruling elder. Still others had just their pastor, who exercised all of the responsibilities and the authorities of a presbytery. Some had no elders at all, but they depended upon the occasional supplies. They were unable, for these circumstances in which they would be placed, to be nothing more than a feeble, germinal Presbyterian church. Not much organization at all. From the beginning of his ministry, what McKemmy witnessed from his extensive travels, he could surely have concluded rightly that he was concerned over the organizational unity of the church within the colonies. Travels from Philadelphia and more populated areas were evidence that Maryland and Virginia lacked in their comparatively underdeveloped regions. In the summer of 1704, McKemmy made his second trip to London, obtained financial and pastoral help to return back to the colonies. And while there, he composed one of his most influential pamphlets. The title, which is reminiscent of somehow some people use the subject line on an email, stated, "Plain and friendly persuasion to the inhabitants of Virginia and Maryland by promoting towns and cohabitation." By a well-wisher to both governments, London in 1705. Do you ever have an email like that? Subject line is just filled. This letter, pamphlet, was written obviously with the interest of the church in mind, but also for the material welfare of the people themselves. As stated, McKemmy wasn't trying to start an argument. He wasn't trying to offend the residents of the colonies. He doesn't want to take any undue advantage over them. He merely wanted to challenge their independent minds. Independent-minded colonists had settled there for generations. And he wanted to show them the advantages, in many ways, it would be to join together and to leave behind their isolationism. Here's a part of the pamphlet that he had written. Towns and cohabitation. Cohabitation, we could almost have a resolution on that, but this is an older word referring to living closer together. Towns and cohabitation with highly advanced religion, which flourishes in most cohabitations. For in remote and scattered settlements, we can never enjoy so fully, frequently, and certainly those privileges and opportunities as to be had in all Christian towns and cities. For by reason of bad weather or other accidents, ministers are prevented and people are hindered to attend and so disappoint one another. But in towns, congregations are never wanting. Children and servants are never without opportunity of hearing, who cannot travel many miles to hear and be catechized. So the practicalities of living together within a town was his bone of contention. He says, this is what we need to pull together as a community. His travels, I think, helped him to understand the ministry backgrounds of the continent and also draw conclusions that would challenge the people. Later in the same pamphlet, he says, neglect of family religion promotes as much irreligion as any one thing beside. Many parents will labor hard, rise up early, sit up late, to provide for the backs and the bellies of their children. And he is worse than an infidel that does not. But what must they be that take no care of and make no provision for their souls, but ruin them by sinful indulgence, and so train up vassals for the devil, instead of training up servants for the living God. And as youth and tender years are fittest for bearing the yoke of religion, so they are the most suitable for receiving impressions of divine knowledge and habits of right living, for want of which early Christian education many run naturally as the sparks fly upward to 1,000 disorders and all excesses of riot. The advantages of being together and the education of the children, provided for food and their care and so forth, but what about their souls? He's saying you are ruining the lives of your families by being so isolated. McKimmey knew that organizational unity was, in fact, essential for not only the growing economy, for security and safety, for education and accountability, but also for the complete functioning of the Presbyterian system. So as he saw it, the separation of members and churches by long distances, poor and non-existent roads, unforgiving landscape, as well as the real threat of Native Americans and bandits, meant that achieving a visible organizational Presbyterian unity was going to be no easy task. And yet, when you think about what McKimmey had accomplished, and actually the church itself, Francis McKimmey's contribution was not so much as theological writings, not so much as scholarship, but it was connecting the disconnected Presbyterian churches. This disconnected weakness of the Presbyterians seemed to have been evident to others also. They noted what was going on within the church. Seen by some correspondents of the time, Anglican minister George Keith, and actually George started out as a Presbyterian minister from Scotland. He became an Anglican, and then he became a Quaker, and then he became an Anglican. He was kind of the butterfly. He had written to the Dr. Thomas Bray, who at the time was the founder of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG for the Anglican Church. This is solely for the furtherance of the gospel of the church in Anglican colonies. Keith goes ahead and writes, "They have here," meaning in Philadelphia, "a Presbyterian meeting and minister, one called Andrews, but they are not like to increase here." This is February 24th of 1702. Jedediah Andrews was that man. He came a few years earlier in 1689 and was ministering to a very fledgling congregation in the city. 1 year later, September of 1703, another letter was sent to the secretary of the SPG from an Anglican by the name of Talbot, in which he says, "Presbyterians here come a great way to lay hands on one another. But after all, I think they had as good stay at home for the good that they do." In other words, they're not much of anything. Although there's real evidence that any presbytery existed at that current time, it's entirely possible and probable that McKimmey, who was a good friend of Andrews, had brought together and secured some Presbyterian ministers to lay hands on Brother Jedediah and bring him officially into the ministry. Yet, by 1705, and this came just prior to the formation of the presbytery, Talbot had written quite an uneasy letter about the prosperity of the First Presbyterian Church. He writes, "There is a new meeting house built for Andrews and almost finished, which I am afraid will draw away a great part of the church," meaning the Anglicans, "if they be not the greatest care taken." So just within a few years, a few periods of time, there was great growth within the church, and others were noticing it also. The impetus for the formation of a presbytery was clear. American Presbyterians were for far too long weak and disconnected. McKimmey witnessed this in his travels, and no doubt personally discussed it with ministers and other members of the church in those travels, as well as in my correspondence with others. One contemporary of McKimmey wrote, "He has hoped to see the blessed results of long years of waiting, mounded and compacted on future enlargement. Our churches have been without any central bond of union. There have been too little to distinguish them from the independency which Mr. McKimmey does not approve. Kind and tolerant to all who hold fundamentals of Christianity, he loves Presbyterianism and wishes to see it established upon its own distinctive basis. Looking back at the things that McKimmey was accomplishing, those words bear true. A presbytery was indeed needed for the licensing, for the ordination of men, for the strengthening of ministers in their particular ministries, to establish the particulars of what we've come to know and understand as the American Presbyterian Church. In a letter to Dr. Benjamin Coleman of Boston, no relation by the way, written in March of the year following the Presbytery meeting on his way north, McKimmey explains the design of the body, the presbytery. He says, "We only had liberty to attend a meeting of ministers we had formally appointed here. This was not a meeting under the Church of Ireland or the Church of Scotland or the Church of England, although the phrase meeting of ministers apparently is a reference to a presbytery, what would be referred to in Scotland and Ireland." He continues and he says, "And there were only 7 in number. At first, we expect a growing number. Our design," and he says our design, I think it was the consensus of the body of the presbytery itself. "Our design is to meet yearly, regular meetings, and oftener if necessary, to consult the most proper measures for advancing religion and propagating Christianity." They saw the necessity at that time. How do we, as a body of ministers, grow? What do we do? He says, "For the propagating of Christianity in various stations, and to maintain such a correspondence as may conduce to the improvement of ministerial abilities." An inward look to the body itself. "By prescribing text to be preached on by 2 of our number at every meeting, which performance is subject to censure of our brethren. Our subject is Paul's epistle to the Hebrews. I and another began and performed our parts, verses 1 and 2. The third part is presented to Mr. Andrews and to another." Eastern Presbytery, guess what will we do? And you enter the challenges is as we finish this, a consensus. This is how we looked at it. We meet together as a body, formulated, this is our design, in order to improve the individual ministries of each one, and to collectively see how we can promote Christianity, promote our American Presbyterianism to others, and then to sharpen the skills of each other, to make sure we understand the doctrine, the things that we hold to be dear and true. The actual meeting itself probably took place in Philadelphia, which was a good location as it is central. The colony had most of the religious freedom that they enjoyed. It's also probable that once organized, the influence of the presbytery in Philadelphia could gradually reach the churches in New Jersey, Long Island, and possibly even up into New England. Strong Presbyterian sentiment existed there. The date is uncertain. First page of the minutes are missing. You can view the page that is available online, and I challenge you to, because the handwriting is horrible, but nonetheless it is there. Those in attendance: Francis McKimmey, George McNeish, John Hampton, and Nathaniel Taylor. All on the eastern shore of Maryland, all the McKimmey men that were there. Included also Samuel Davies and John Wilson, both from Delaware. And Jedediah Andrews, originally from New England, but now the host pastor. That's the 7 that McKimmey refers to. No doubt these were men that he not only visited, but corresponded with and talked over, and a consensus was formed as to who they were. McKimmey is listed as the moderator. What minutes do exist? When the presbytery adjourns, it's with the understanding that the moderator, Mr. McKimmey, and Mr. Hampton and Mr. Andrews will meet in Freehold, New Jersey, for the purpose of examining and ordaining the candidate, Mr. John Boyd. Boyd becomes the first licensed and ordained minister of the presbytery. What growth and what confidence. And the Anglican Church obviously understand what was taking place, what God was doing. That church in Philadelphia grew. They did build a beautiful church for Andrews, otherwise meeting in almost like a garage setting. I want to close with a paragraph from Dr. Charles Briggs. We don't necessarily refer to Dr. Briggs as being the pillar of theology, but I think his understanding of the Presbyterian Church is quite valid. He says, the American Presbyterian Church began historically at the bottom, and it truly was. And only by degrees did it rise into the magnificent system which we now behold, which was the 1880s. It was a free and natural growth in accordance with the preferences of the congregations themselves. American Presbyterianism was born and nurtured and reached its maturity in freedom. It developed naturally in accordance with the circumstances of the country. It was not imposed upon by civil or ecclesiastical tribunals. Uniquely developed, uniquely profited from those who came from the Scotland and Ireland and filled the colonies, and then for men to come along and be able to make the ties and bring them all together. With the understanding it was for the propagation of the gospel. We're a product of that, and we're thankful for what Francis McKimmey has done. The only picture of Francis McKimmey was actually lost in a fire. It's apparently a portrait for him. There's a statue down near Rehoboth that exists, apparent likeness that somebody had said this is what he looks like. Not much of his material exists, but his heritage is there for us. I trust that it will encourage us as a synod, as individual presbyteries, to continue to move forward in the same vein, sharpen each other's skills, and helping us to accomplish the task of bringing forth Christ into the country. Let's pray.